John Dean, you stand accused of this heinous crime. What say you in your defense?
If you believe that an 8-year-old child would be forgiven for making a mistake, then forget that thought entirely, at least not in 17th century England, where a boy named John Dean was taken to the gallows. A rope was tied around his neck, and he died slowly, suspended in silence before the eyes of a town that could do nothing but watch. His supposed crime was never truly proven, but his death bore the signature of a cold court, a justice system without pity, and a king who would, 2 décades later, and face the same fate himself, this time with the eyes of the entire kingdom watching. The story begins in Windsor, where the royal castle rises among fog-shrouded forests, and the people live in the shadow of the crown like leaves beneath an ancient oak, proud, but terrified. The year was 1629, and the country was ruled by King Charles I, a monarch anointed by the church, but deaf to the voices of Parliament, whose stubbornness would later spark the bloodiest civil war ever fought on English soil. But before the clash of armies, before royal blood stained the scaffold, before Charles himself bowed his head beneath the axe, a child died not for power, not for politics, but as a warning, a sacrifice, a display of the law's merciless reach. His name was John Dean. He was either 8 or 9 years old, born to a family so obscure that no record remains of his parents, his daily life, or even his voice, only the date of his arrest and the method of his death. On a cold February day, he was taken to the Abingdon Assizes Court and charged with arson. To modern ears, that might sound like mischief, but in 17th century England, fire was no game. It was a threat to property, to lineage, to wealth itself. The law was clear. Arson meant death, and in that era, criminal responsibility began at the age of 7. If a child could walk, talk, and form intent, the noose did not ask for mercy. It was on the 23rd of February, 1629, that John Dean stood before the judge. He had no lawyer, no advocate, no one to speak on his behalf. The courtroom was built for men, its benches high, its tones severe, and there stood a child, barely tall enough to look over the rail. The presiding judge declared that Dean had acted with malice, revenge, craft, and cunning, words more often used to describe hardened killers than young boys who could barely read. Yet those 4 accusations would be all it took to seal his fate. The evidence was unclear, the damage minimal, and no lives had been lost in the fires he was blamed for. But none of that mattered. Once the charge was spoken, once the judge believed he had glimpsed wickedness in a child's eyes, the sentence was already written. Normally, such a sentence might be commuted. Children were sometimes spared, especially girls. Many boys between the ages of 7 and 13 were sentenced, but not executed. But not this time. Not for John Dean. He was, it seems, to be made an example, a lesson to the people of Windsor that justice would not waver, even for those still learning to write their names. And so, just days later, the boy was taken to the gallows in Abingdon. There was no sudden drop. The hanging methods of the time were not quick. The executioner tied the rope gently around his small neck, helped him up onto the stool, and, when the sentence was read aloud for all to hear, kicked the stool aside. What followed was not a swift end, but a slow, choking silence. The wind howled around the platform. The child's legs kicked. His small hands clawed the air. The crowd stood still, not cheering, not gasping, just watching. Some turned away, some wept, but no one intervened, because the law had spoken, and the crown had watched from afar. And here lies the most chilling truth. No death sentence could be carried out in England at the time without approval from the crown or a member of the king's privy council. Which means that King Charles I, ruling from nearby Windsor Castle, almost certainly knew of this case, and chose to let it proceed. He may not have seen the boy with his own eyes, but he lived close enough to smell the smoke of the barns, to hear the whispers in the court, to pass judgment by silence. Whether through indifference or intent, the monarchy allowed it to happen. John Dean's death did not stop the world. England moved on, but a crack appeared that day, a silent fracture in the illusion of royal justice, and in that fracture, a seed of rebellion was planted. 20 years later, the people would rise, and Charles I would walk to his own execution scaffold, not as a king, but as a man brought down by the same laws he once ignored. But John Dean, just 8 years old, sentenced in silence, buried in an unmarked grave, would become the first ghost in that long line of reckoning. A child whose death was not a tragedy, but a message written in rope and fear, a message that the law, without mercy, becomes just another name for cruelty. On the morning of the 23rd of February, in the year 1629, the courtroom in Abingdon was heavy with smoke from candles too short to be lit again, and the murmurs of townsfolk who had never seen a trial with such a young defendant. The boy in question was no older than 8. John Dean. Small in frame, pale with fear, his feet barely touching the stone floor as he was made to stand alone, the wooden platform rising far above his head, and behind him, the bailiffs shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether they were guarding a criminal or a child who'd wandered too far from home. But in this courtroom, age did not matter, intent did. And what the law looked for in those cold pews was not innocence but knowing malice. And that morning, it believed it, found it. The town had heard whispers. 2 barns in Windsor had burned weeks before, blackened beams collapsing in the snow. Grain turned to ash, and no clear culprit. At first, people blamed the wind, then the chimney sweeps, then a drunk laborer. But somehow, the story took a turn. Children had been seen near the property. Then, someone said, 1 child. Then, someone said John Dean. How the fire truly started, whether by accident or design, was never certain. But what became certain very quickly was the shape of the story. It needed a name. It needed a face. And John's was the one that stuck. He had no advocata, no family member known to come forward, and no counsel to argue his case. The idea of legal defense for children was not even considered. To the court, his age was not a shield, but an inconvenience. He could walk. He could speak. And he had, according to one witness, once been seen lighting a small fire near a fence to warm his hands. That was enough. From there, the rest was stitched together like old gossip passed down the lane. One rumor piled upon another until it stood tall enough to cast a shadow longer than any boy could step out from. The judge presiding over the case, whose name history has not bothered to remember, leaned forward in his great wooden chair and looked upon the child not with sympathy, but with calculation. He spoke of the age of reason, that mystical threshold set by statute law, declaring that 7 years was enough for a soul to know right from wrong. And John was older than that. Just a year, but enough to clear the first hurdle on the road to death. In that moment, the boy's future narrowed to a corridor with no doors and no light at the end. The charge was read aloud, formal and cold. Arson, the willful destruction of property by fire. A capital crime, not because of the damage, but because of the symbolism. In a feudal world where power was measured by what one owned land, livestock, food, burning a barn was not simply sabotage, it was war. And John Dean, though no taller than a scythe handle, had become a symbol himself, a threat to order, to ownership, to the way the world was supposed to be arranged. The courtroom was not large, but it was packed. Most had come out of curiosity. Who could believe a child would be tried for such a crime? But that curiosity turned to discomfort as the proceeding wore on. John did not cry. He did not speak. Not out of defiance, but because no one had told him what to say. When asked if he understood the charges, he nodded. When asked why he did it, he said he didn't know. And that was the end of his defense. And then came the words that would end his life. 4 simple words, delivered without emotion by a man whose powdered wig smelled of candle wax and ink, malice, revenge, craft, cunning. The judge did not shout them. He did not need to. They were written into the record like chisel marks in stone. He claimed that John had acted not out of childish accident, but out of hatred, that his mind, though young, was poisoned with revenge, that he had shown deliberate intent, had planned, had chosen. No evidence was provided, no witness recalled, just the weight of assumption, and it was enough. Those 4 words were more than description, they were judgment. In the eyes of the law, they transformed a frightened child into something else, a moral threat, and threats, even small ones, were not tolerated under the reign of Charles I, who, from his perch in nearby Windsor Castle, had begun to wage quieter wars against anything that dared resist the crown's control. Parliament, Puritans, peasants, and now, a boy. The room fell silent as the judge delivered the sentence, to be hanged by the neck until dead. No deliberation. No jury. Only the hammerfall of a gavel and the breath of one world ending inside the lungs of a child too stunned to speak. The town clerk wrote it down, hands shaking slightly. The magistrates turned away, some of them blinking harder than usual. But the decision was made. The boy would die, and he would die publicly. It is difficult now, centurilateur, to understand how a society could allow this. But perhaps that is the true lesson here. Not that it happened, but that so many accepted it. The people who watched from the gallery were not monsters. They were cobblers, blacksmiths, farmers, widows. They loved their own children. They likely told themselves that John Dean must have done something terrible, something unspeakable, something they weren't told. Because to believe otherwise would mean believing that the world they lived in was built on a lie, that justice was a performance, that law was a weapon, that mercy was not for the poor. And so they went home and set more logs on their hearths, and prayed that their children would not be seen, not be noticed, and not be dragged to court for something that began as a game. But none of that mattered to John Dean. His fate had already been sealed by a story he could not control. What followed the trial is now legend. He was kept overnight in a stone cell with a straw mattress and a wooden pail. He ate nothing. He spoke to no one. Some say he cried quietly. Others say he sat still for hours, as if rehearsing for the moment when the floor would vanish beneath him. On the morning of his execution, he was led to the scaffold by guards who did not speak. He wore no shoes. The crowd that gathered was hushed. more confused than angry, more haunted than vengeful. They had come to see justice, but what they saw instead was a child who had been given no future. The executioner, too, is lost to time. Perhaps he had done this 100 times. Perhaps this was his first child. Perhaps he hesitated before tying the knot. Perhaps he didn't. But when he kicked the stool out from under John Dean's feet, there was no cheer, no gasp. Only the slow, suffocating silence of a town learning what cruelty actually looked like. In the end, John Dean was buried in an unmarked grave. No ceremony. No marker. No prayers. His story might have ended there, another forgotten casualty of a brutal time, but something about him refused to vanish. His name reappeared in records, in whispered tales, in the margins of books where historians asked quietly, how could this have happened? The answer is in those 4 words. Malice, revenge, craft, cunning. They were not proof. They were not fact. They were the cloak that allowed grown men to kill a child and call it justice. And once spoken, they could not be taken back. They had the weight of the crown, the silence of the crowd, and the indifference of a world built to protect power, not innocence. There was no sound. Not really. Not the kind of sound one expects when a crowd gathers to watch a life be taken. No hissing. No shouting. No gasps. Only the soft brushing of shoes against earth. The creaking of wood as bodies shifted weight from one foot to the other. And the low, uncertain breathing of people who knew they had come to see something they could never unsee, but could not bring themselves to stop it. It was early morning in Abingdon, in the year 1629, and the mist was still rising from the frozen soil when John Dean was led out from his cell. The boy walked without being dragged, not because he understood what was about to happen, but because no one had explained that he had the right to collapse. His hands were bound. His hair was too long. His feet bare. The guards didn't touch him more than necessary. And though they did not speak, the shape of their silence said everything. The priest at his side was quiet too, holding a small Bible that would never be opened, because the boy did not know how to read. And scripture has little comfort when you cannot understand its words. The scaffold had been erected hastily, as it often was in smaller towns. A platform of roughly hammered boards with a crossbeam for the rope, and a single wooden stool placed beneath. The executioner arrived last, carrying the noose in his hand, like a man bringing a gift he never wanted to offer. He was not dressed in black. There was no hood. This was not London. Not a royal execution. This was countryside justice. And justice, when it is too familiar, wears no costume at all. John Dean was helped onto the stool. He did not resist. His eyes scanned the crowd. Not with hatred. Not even with fear. But with the confusion of a child who still hoped, somehow, that this was a mistake someone would correct at the last moment. But no one stepped forward. No voice broke the quiet. And though many in the crowd could not meet his gaze, no one looked away quickly enough to forget the shape of his face. The executioner, an older man with trembling hands, fumbled slightly with the rope. Perhaps it was the cold. Perhaps it was something deeper. It is not easy to loop the noose around a neck so small. The child stood still, the fibers brushing his cheek as the knot settled above his shoulder. There was no speech, no final words, no last read aloud, only the soft thud of the crowd shifting again, like the tide pulling back from the shore. And then it happened. The stool was kicked aside, not violently, not carelessly, but with a kind of mercy That did not matter in the end. The boy dropped just inches, and the rope caught, but it did not snap his neck. It was not designed to. This was not the long drop method that would later come to make executions quicker, more clinical. This was the old way, the slow way, the way that kills by suffocation, not by fracture. John Dean began to twist. His body convulsed gently, as if the wind had taken hold of him. His legs kicked once, twice, then stopped. His hands clenched. His eyes closed. The rope tightened. And time. For a moment, I forgot how to move forward. The scaffold did not shake. It did not creak. It did not groan. It stood still as if it had never been touched. Because a child weighs so little. Because his life had not been allowed to grow heavy. Because when a boy of 8 is executed, the only sound should be silence. And silence there was. The crowd stood frozen. Mothers held their children closer, pressing their palms against eyes that were not yet old enough to make sense of what they had just seen. Older men removed their hats, but not out of reverence, only to have something to do with their hands. Some wept, though none would admit it. Others whispered prayers they had not spoken in years, but most simply stood there, breathing, blinking, doing nothing, because nothing could be done. And somewhere, far away, Windsor Castle stood quiet. It is not known if King Charles I looked out his window that morning. It is not known if word of the hanging reached him by nightfall, or if it took days for the parchment to arrive. But one thing is certain, the execution could not have taken place without royal permission, whether given directly or through the Privy Council. The Crown had said yes, and because of that, no one in Abingdon said no. The boy's body hung for some time. No bell tolled. No official declared the moment of death. He was left swaying gently in the morning air until someone, eventually, climbed the steps, loosened the rope, and lowered him down. What happened next is unclear. Some say he was buried in a common grave outside the town. Others say he was left for a time in a pit behind the court before the gravedigger could be paid. What is certain is that there was no monument, no name carved in stone, no candle lit, and the scaffold was taken down before sunset, as if nothing had happened, as if the platform had only been used to fix a roof or mend a fence or dry the harvest straw. But the crowd remembered, not in loud ways, not in protests. This was not an age for defiance, but in the way they avoided the square for days afterward, in the way shopkeepers spoke more softly, in the way children were held closer, scolded less, watched more carefully, in the way the name John Dean began to carry a weight it had never held before. He had not screamed. He had not begged. He had not cursed. And in that silence, the people saw themselves obedient, helpless, trying not to be next. The law had been followed, the punishment delivered, the example made, but no one clapped. No one praised the judge. No one wrote poems or hymns. What had been done felt wrong, though no one could say exactly why. Because it had all been legal, all by the book, all proper, and yet, something had shifted. The scaffold may not have shaken, but something inside the people did. A slow, unspoken tremor that would take 20 years to rise to the surface, when the king himself would be dragged to trial, and the people, at last, would no longer look away. But that morning, in the year of 1629, in a small English town where justice wore no mask and mercy was not written in law, a child was killed in silence, and the scaffold did not shake, because it never needed to. The only thing that broke was the world. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a speech. He did not even dip the quill himself. Perhaps, but somewhere between the burnt barns of Windsor and the swaying body of John Dean in Abingdon, a piece of parchment passed through the hands of a man whose title gave him the power to kill without ever having to look a child in the eyes. And that man was Charles, the first of his name, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, a sovereign raised not for war, nor for governance, but for ceremony and pageantry, who found himself wielding laws sharper than any sword, and used them with a silence that echoed louder than orders ever could. To understand how a monarch comes to sign the death of a boy, one must first understand the world. He ruled a world where law did not rise from the people, but fell from the throne like dust, shaken from the hem of a velvet robe. In the year 1629, England was not yet the land of Locke and liberty. It was a realm where the divine right of kings still wrapped the crown like a halo, and where the ruler was believed to answer only to God, not to Parliament, not to the courts, and certainly not to the cries of a barefoot child. And Charles, raised in shadow, shaped by loss, and crowned in tension, had never been taught to listen. He came to the throne in the year 1625, just 4 years before John Dean's trial, inheriting a kingdom already fraying at the edges. His father, James I, had ruled with flamboyance and uneasy grace, but Charles was different, withdrawn, private, with a face carved from dignity and a heart buried under pride. He distrusted Parliament from the beginning, saw débat as défiance, and believed in the sacredness of rule, as though it were carved into the marrow of his bones. To him, a signed warrant was not cruelty, it was duty. It was justice made manifest through ink and seal. And so, when news reached the Privy Council of the arson in Windsor, it would not have been ignored. The proximity to royal residence, the symbolic weight of fire so close to the seat of the crown would have been discussed with grave attention. Though no one can prove that Charles personally read the documents concerning John Dean, it is nearly impossible that a case requiring execution within walking distance of Windsor Castle could have escaped royal notice. At the very least, one of his counselors, acting in his name, would have approved it. And in a world where the will of the monarch extended into every judgment, that approval may as well have been the king's own breath. There is no record of hesitation, no marginal note scribbled in doubt, no royal footnote expressing mercy. Just silence. A silence that moved faster than justice and more deadly than truth. The law that allowed a child to be hanged was not new. It had slithered its way through centuries, from feudal codes and Roman echoes, winding into English common law like a vine across stone. The age of 7 had long been fixed as the threshold of criminal responsibility, not because children understood justice at that age, but because society needed a line, and children were easier to blame than systems. Arson, especially, had always been punished harshly, not because of the flames themselves, but because of what they threatened: property, stability, the image of control. A barn reduced to ashes meant loss of grain, but it also meant a wound to pride, a crack in order, a challenge to the invisible hierarchy that kept peasants kneeling and lords upright. So when the court declared that John Dean had shown malice, revenge, craft, and cunning, it wasn't speaking to the boy, it was speaking to the monarchy. It was offering a justification, a narrative clean enough for the king's conscience. This was no foolish child who dropped a candle. This was a mind tainted by sin, a little body possessed by threat. And Charles, who had always preferred order to questions. I would have read those words or heard them whispered and nodded. Quietly, indifferently, perhaps even thankfully. He had other problems. By the time John Dean's body was buried, Charles was already deep into battle with Parliament. His refusal to compromise, to share power, to bend even slightly, had turned what might have been constitutional tension into a slow-motion political explosion. Within months, he would dissolve Parliament altogether, ruling alone in what would be called the 11 Years' Tyranny. Taxes would rise, discontent would simmer, and the air would grow heavier with the smell of something coming, something vast and red and inevitable. But on the morning of the execution, Charles still held the reins, and the law that killed John Dean would outlive both of them. Even after Charles himself was dragged before a court, and accused not of arson but of treason against his own people. The machinery of that same law remained untouched. In the year 1649, 20 years after a child died on a wooden scaffold, a king stood upon his own. The irony did not escape the people. The man who had allowed executions without mercy now faced his own without plea. And yet, the difference was vast. Charles had a trial. Charles had a defense. Charles had speeches and loyalists, and printed declarations of honor. John Dean had none of that. Only a rope. The law had not changed. Even after Charles was gone. Even after monarchy fell. Then rose again with his son. Even after Parliament returned. And the people sang of freedom. The law that declared 7 years old to be old enough to hang a child remained on the books. For centuries, whispered about. Rarely used. But always there. Coiled in silence. Waiting for someone to ask whether cruelty written in ink still held weight in blood. And so, in the quiet aftermath of a king's reign, one must ask, what does it mean to rule? Is it the power to sign a decree, to raise taxes, to raise armies, or is it the weight of responsibility when that power leads a child to the gallows? Charles signed in silence, and perhaps that was his greatest legacy. Not the Civil War, not the execution, but the moment, long before the drums of rebellion began, when he let a boy die not because he hated him, not even because he knew him, but because the law said so, and he believed the law was his to command. That is the story that outlived him. Not the crown, not the portrait, not the prayer book pressed against his chest on the scaffold, but the silence that kills, the silence that signs, the silence that stays. There is a strange kind of cruelty that hides itself behind assumptions. A quiet and ordinary kind that does not raise its voice, does not wear a mask, and does not require proof, only the comfort of certainty. The kind people whisper to each other so they can sleep at night. The kind that allows a child to be condemned for a fire that may never have happened. Or if it did, may never have been his doing. Or if it was, may never have been a crime at all. For the truth is this, no surviving record proves beyond doubt that the barns ever truly burned as they were described. No official inventory was made of damage. No testimonies confirm that John Dean was seen with flame in hand. And no name of a victim. No injured party. No displaced family has ever been traced back to the supposed crime scene in Windsor. The charge was arson. The sentence was death. But the details in between have vanished like smoke and wind. What we know or think we know is that sometime before February of the year 1629, 2 barns or houses in the region of Windsor were said to have caught fire. The cause was not witnessed. Or if it was, the witnesses never came forward under oath. There are no dates of the blaze recorded. No parish ledgers that list damages. No receipts for rebuilding. What we have instead is hearsay passed to paper. Second-hand suspicion molded into legal form. And the assertion by a judge that a child barely past the age of 7 showed signs of premeditation, malice, and calculated harm. That word malice was not just the hinge of the case. It was the rope itself, coiled around a boy's neck long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. And yet, who lit the match? Did a fire truly consume those buildings? Or was it merely the idea of fire? The fear of it. The panic it provoked in a town, already heavy with tension, that gave it shape and consequence in an era where wooden homes pressed shoulder to shoulder and chimney smoke hung low in winter skies. The smallest spark was enough to summon dread. A boy seen playing near kindling, a broken lantern, a mischievous glance. Any of these could be twisted into confession if repeated often enough, and in the hands of lawmen eager to restore calm. Sometimes a scapegoat served more peace than the truth ever could. So no one asked where the fire started. No one asked why there were no burn marks on Dean's clothing. Why no one remembered screaming or smoke or buckets being passed from hand to hand. No one examined the wood. No one tested his story. Instead, what was asked was simpler. Was he old enough to understand what fire does? The answer was yes. And in that moment, and guilt was born not from evidence, but from expectation. It is easy, century la terre, to assume that justice failed, John Dean. But in truth, it never even tried. He was never offered the presumption of innocence. He was never given the benefit of context. There were no considerations for motive, no discussions of accident, no pleas for leniency. The verdict was a conclusion, masquerading as process, a story decided before it was told. Perhaps the judge believed the boy was dangerous. Or perhaps the judge believed something else, that leniency was weakness, that fear kept order, that a public hanging even of a child would remind the town that law had no room for softness. It is even possible that the judge, or those around him, and had other motives: political pressure, personal grudges, whispers in ears from those who stood to gain from a quick conviction. And yet, what makes this story so harrowing is not that the truth was distorted, but that no one bothered to seek it. The fire was accepted. The boy was blamed. The rest was silence. And that silence was contagious. The people of Abingdon, of Windsor, of surrounding villages, all of them lived through the trial and the execution without protest. Perhaps some doubted the sentence. Perhaps some murmured over bread or behind closed shutters that the boy didn't seem the type, that the barns weren't truly destroyed, that justice had moved too fast. But none of those doubts ever reached the record. No letters of complaint, no appeals, no petitions, because doubt, when it is inconvenient, folds itself quietly and tucks into the pocket of the next day's routine. And so John Dean became guilty by design, not by action. He became the fire. And once you are seen as fire, there is only one fate the law will grant you. Even the phrase accused of arson is misleading. There was no real accusation. No person stood before the court and said, "I saw him." There was only the collection of suggestion, of inference, of adult suspicion projected onto a child's quiet demeanor. And once suspicion becomes enough, once fear replaces fact, then the question changes not, "Did he do it?" but, "What shall we do with him now?" And when the answer becomes "hang him," it is not justice speaking, it is fear in robes. In the centuries since, no historian has found the burned buildings. No parish archive records their destruction. No compensation claims. No charred beams. No plaques. Only the name of a boy. the date of a trial, and the memory of a rope. We call him the youngest known person executed in England. But what we do not call him, what we never dared to call him, is innocent. Because to call him that now would be to admit something unthinkable, that a child died for a fire that never burned. And if that is true, if no barn burned, if no person was harmed, if no flames ever rose into the sky above Windsor, then what was John Dean's crime? It was not arson. It was being alone. It was being seen near where trouble once happened. It was being young, poor, voiceless, and inconvenient. And that, in the eyes of 17th century England, was enough to take his life. No one counted them. No one wrote down how many there were. No clerk of the court. No church warden. No town crier listed the names of the children who stood beneath the gallows on that gray morning in Abingdon. When the rope was tied around the neck of a boy, no older than themselves, and the air turned colder, though the wind did not rise. But they were there, the small ones, the curious ones, the ones too young to understand, and the ones just old enough to know they should never have come, who watched in silence, their mittens clutched in mother's hands or hanging forgotten at their sides. They saw it all, because no one had told them not to look. Perhaps they were told it was a lesson, perhaps their parents brought them deliberately, muttering that the law must be feared and order respected, that boys who play with fire will find themselves above a stool they cannot stand on for long. Or perhaps they simply followed the crowd, as children do, weaving through boots and cloaks until they found a clear space near the front, too small to be pushed away, too invisible to be noticed by the guards who kept the grown-ups behind the rope. But however they came, they stayed, not because they wanted to see death, but because no one turned them away. And so they stood there 20, maybe 30, maybe more, watching as the executioner fumbled with the knot, watching as the priest whispered words no one remembered, watching as John Dean, thin and pale and quiet, stepped onto the stool without resistance, watching as the rope lifted him off the earth and made him still, and the world changed for them, not with screams, not with tears, but with something deeper, something slower, a silence that crawled behind their eyes and made a home, because once you see a child die, and no one stops it, the world no longer belongs to you, it belongs to fear. And those children, though no one wrote their names, though no statue ever bore their memory, became the last witnesses of something England would spend generations trying to forget, that justice, when it loses its soul, becomes something even the innocent cannot escape. Afterward, they returned home, and the law that killed John Dean would outlive both of them, even after Charles himself was dragged before a court, accused not of arson, but of treason against his own people. The machinery of that same law remained untouched. In the year 1649, 20 years after a child died on a wooden scaffold, a king stood upon his own. The irony did not escape the people. The man who had allowed executions without mercy now faced his own without plea. No one talked about the children who had watched, but they remembered, in the way they played less loudly in the streets, in the way they flinched when they saw rope, even in the hands of a tradesman, in the way some of them stopped speaking altogether for weeks, and in the way, years later, when they became adults and had children of their own, they kept them close and never let them near the square when the gallows were built again. Because gallows were not rare, they returned, as they always did, raised for thieves and rebels and the nameless poor. But something had shifted in Abingdon, not in law, not in decree, not in any official record, but in the breath between sentences, in the glances passed over tankards in the alehouse, in the quiet that fell whenever someone asked, "Do you remember that winter? The one when the boy was hanged?" And someone always answered, "Which boy?" Because it was easier to pretend they didn't know. But they did. Everyone did. Because even if they hadn't been there, they knew someone who had. A cousin, a sister, a brother who came home and didn't eat for 2 days. And that is how silence spreads, not with denial, but with complicity. And so the town stayed quiet. Not because it had nothing to say, but because speaking would have required an admission too heavy to carry, that they had watched a child die and said nothing, that they had told themselves it was justice, even when their hearts said otherwise, that they had allowed the law to borrow their eyes and their feet and their silence, and in doing so, had made themselves part of it. And so, when the children grew older, and their own children asked about the gallows, they shrugged. They said it was a long time ago. They said they were too young to remember. They said it was different then. And in those excuses, John Dean was buried again. Not in earth, but in memory, under layers of forgetting, sealed by generations who would rather not disturb the soil. And yet, sometimes one of those children, now gray and stooped and hollow-eyed, would pause when passing the square and glance at the spot where the scaffold had once stood, and they would remember a boy with bare feet and a rope that did not break, and the sound the world made when it did nothing. They never carved him a stone. They never marked the place. No cross. No initials. No wreath of flowers left to decay with the seasons. Somewhere in the quiet earth beyond the edge of Abingdon, in the common ground where paupers and outlaws and the nameless were laid to rest, a boy of 8 was buried without ceremony, without prayer, and without witness. The cold dirt accepted him as it had accepted hundreds before. And above that dirt, the town moved on. But there are some names that refuse to stay buried. No matter how deep they are pushed, no matter how many years pass, and no matter how many voices fall silent around them, John Dean's was one of those names. It began as a whisper, the kind of murmur that lingers at the edge of candles after the church has emptied, when the wind knocks gently against stained glass, and the last person to leave pauses just a moment too long at the door. There were no official sermons, no mention in parish records, but someone, somewhere, remembered. And in the remembering, the name was spoken again quietly. Like a confession. Perhaps it was a priest, many years later, who found the court record in a bundle of yellowed parchment and asked aloud, not to anyone in particular, why would they hang a child? Perhaps it was a gravedigger, passing by the unmarked patch of grass where no flowers ever grew, who muttered to an apprentice that a boy had been thrown into the soil there long ago, after the frost had hardened the ground and the gallows had been taken down before nightfall. Or perhaps it was the children. They walked back through the crooked lanes of Abingdon, past shuttered windows and soot-stained chimneys, past bakeries that had not opened that morning, past doors that did not greet them. And in their silence, the town found its own. Parents did not ask what they had seen. Teachers did not mention it in lessons. The church, that Sunday, I did not speak his name. And slowly, the hanging of John Dean slipped beneath the town's surface like a stone into a deep, well-present, but unreachable, only his name, John Dean. They said he haunted the place, that he never spoke, but walked at dusk, that if you left a candle burning near the fence post and whispered his name 3 times, You'd feel a tug on your sleeve as if someone wanted you to follow. That he wasn't angry, just cold. Just lonely. Just looking for someone to listen. And maybe that was true. Because long after the last person who had seen him hang had turned to dust, his name persisted. Not in libraries, not in printed books, but in the places that forget nothing, in door frames that creaked a second time for no reason, in shadows that lingered beside the pulpit longer than the morning sun allowed, in the hesitations of old women who lit candles with shaking hands and didn't know why their fingers trembled when they passed the south wall of the chapel. The name was never shouted, never carved, but it was there, and like water through stone, it worked its way through history. 2 centuries later, when historians began to gather the forgotten corners of English law, they found his case. Almost by accident, buried beneath the records of thieves and traitors and debtors and madwomen. A single line. A date. A verdict. Guilty. Hanged. Age. 8 years. No appeal. No mercy. And the scholars, who had read of beheadings and floggings and traitors' deaths, stopped. Because something about the simplicity of that entry was more brutal than any spectacle. It was not a grand execution. It was not a famous one. It was not political. It was just a child. A rope. A platform. A town. And the silence that followed. And so they began to write him back into the world. Carefully. Slowly. Not with justice, because justice, once denied, cannot be retrofitted, but with memory, with words, with acknowledgement. And once again, his name was spoken, not as a warning, but as a question. How could this happen? And that question echoed louder than any bell. The next generation, and the one after that, who grew up hearing snatches of the story, half believed and half feared. A bedtime tale turned on its head, where the monster was not in the woods, but on the scaffold. And the victim was no older than themselves. They whispered it in the graveyard, behind trees, under the breathless hush of fog, not with cruelty, but with the solemn awe that only children can give to the unspeakable. They didn't know his full story. They didn't need to. It rang through churchyards, where a patch of grass with no stone was finally named, if only in unofficial maps. As the boy's place, a name passed from sexton to sexton, never written, but never lost. And even now, in the quiet corners of Abingdon, if you visit near twilight, when the sky turns the color of ash and the trees lean in just a little closer, you might still hear it. Not a cry, not a scream, just a whisper, a name, John Dean. And in that whisper, the weight of what was done, not to a martyr, not to a rebel, not to a king, but to a child. And the land remembers. Even when the people try to forget, the rope was cut, the body was buried, the scaffold was taken down, and the square was swept clean. But the law that allowed a child of 8 years to be condemned to death and hanged in public, remained untouched. It did not tremble. It did not retreat. It simply folded itself back into the parchment and precedent it had always lived within, waiting not to be questioned, not to be challenged, but simply to be used again. And for centuries, it slept. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had been accepted, because cruelty, once written in ink and sealed with wax, gains a kind of invisibility when too many people learn to walk past it without blinking, for generation after generation. The law of criminal responsibility in England remained the same. 7 years old. That was the age at which a child could be deemed aware enough, responsible enough, dangerous enough to be punished as an adult. The statute did not distinguish between accident and intent, between confusion and malevolence. It merely asked one question: did the child know right from wrong? And if the answer, however shallow, was yes, then the full machinery of punishment could proceed, unburdened by pity. No one thought to change it. Not after the death of John Dean. Not after the reign of Charles I gave way to civil war, and then to the brief, cold clarity of a republic. Not after the monarchy returned. Not after new kings wore new crowns and old battles became old stories. Even as England softened its punishments, even as the spectacle of public execution began to fade into the folds of a more modern age, the law itself remained untouched in that one regard. 7 years. That number endured, not out of reason, but out of habit. And in law, the habit becomes gospel if left alone long enough. And so, long after the gallows in Abingdon were dismantled, and long after the name of John Dean slipped from everyday speech, there were still children who found themselves in courtrooms too large for their shoes, facing accusations too sharp for their years. Some were spared, some were not. But the principle remained. And every now and then, the ghost of John Dean stirred quietly beneath the surface of a trial unseen but felt. It was not until the 20th century, more than 300 years after a child had been hanged by royal authority, that England finally raised the age of criminal responsibility, not dramatically, not with loud apology, but with quiet reform, as if the law were being gently woken from a long and shameful sleep. In the year 1933, the age was raised to 8, then 10, then finally, with hesitations and exceptions and debates, it crept forward again. But by then, John Dean had become more than a case. He had become a symbol, a question mark carved into the bones of justice itself. And yet, while the law slept, his memory did not. It clung to the corners of archives. It haunted footnotes. It was whispered in lectures and passed between historians who specialized not in the great monarchs or the noble wars, but in the dark spaces in between, the places where the overlooked and the silenced waited to be remembered. And slowly, over the course of centuries, his name began to return. Not with rage, but with reflection. Not to indict, but to illuminate. It became part of the conversation, not just about law, but about mercy, not just about crime, but about childhood, and not just about punishment, but about the responsibility of those who create systems powerful enough to end lives and silent enough to forget them. His story was retold in articles and essays, in court reform debates and educational policy discussions. Teachers spoke of him not to frighten, but to teach. Writers invoked his name to show that history does not always belong to the powerful, that sometimes the most lasting legacy is not forged by kings, but by the children they failed to protect. And still, his memory did not fade, because memory, unlike law, does not require permission to endure. It does not wait for signatures or amendments. It slips into lullabies and cautionary tales. It appears in the tremble of a judge's hand when sentencing a child. It lingers in the way a mother watches her son cross a street, remembering that once, long ago, a boy not so different was led across a square to die for something no one proved he had done. John Dean became the memory the law could not erase, and perhaps that is justice, not in courts, not in verdicts, but in the fact that one name, so nearly lost, kept rising, and that centuries later, it is still being spoken. There is something about stories told in the quiet, just before sleep, that allows us to hear the things we cannot bear to face in daylight. In those last still moments, before the world disappears behind closed eyes, memory softens its edges, and history stops, shouting long enough for us to understand what was whispered all along. And perhaps that is the only way to tell the story of John Dean, not with fire or fury, not with noise or vengeance, but with a voice low enough that even the dead might pause to listen, a voice soft enough that even the law might feel ashamed. Because in the end, that is what this was, a shame that came too late, a sorrow that arrived centuries after the rope had tightened, long after the last person who had looked away had been buried themselves, a reflection born not out of justice, but out of absence, the absence of a defense, the absence of mercy, the absence of anyone brave enough to say this is wrong before it was too late to matter. John Dean was not a prince. He was not a prophet. He did not write anything. He did not build anything. He left no descendants. He died before he could love, before he could sin, before he could even understand why a judge had called him cunning. He was 8 years old, and in the eyes of the crown, that was old enough to be condemned, but in the eyes of memory, true memory, the kind that cannot be ruled or silenced, it was not enough. It would never be enough. And so, centurie la terre, we speak his name, not to demand retribution. He is beyond that now. Not to rewrite history. It cannot be undone, but to keep a promise that there will always be those who remember, that there will always be voices that rise gently at night to say, "We see you now." Even if the scaffold stood for only one morning, even if the stone was never carved, even if the crown forgot your name before the earth covered your face, because there are stories that do not vanish. They live in the corners of churches and the creak of courthouse stairs. They breathe in candle smoke. They settle into lullabies. And if we are quiet long enough, if we dare to be still, they return not as ghosts, not as punishments, but as reminders that justice without compassion is nothing more than cruelty in uniform. John Dean was hanged in the year 1629. The law that allowed it remained unchanged for more than 300 years, and by the time the law softened, the child had already become dust, and the name had become legend, and the lesson had been folded too many times into the margins of history books. Rarely taught, rarely heard. But tonight, as we close this story, we do not bury him again. We remember him, the boy who died quietly, the law that stood silently, the town that looked away, and the whisper that did not. So if you hear his name in a dream spoken softly by a voice you cannot see, know this: he is not asking for justice. He is asking not to be forgotten. And for as long as we tell his story in the hush before sleep, he won't be.